My name's Galen Beery, and I've been asked to explain a little bit about what I was doing with the Hmong over 40 years ago. When I graduated from University of La Verne, which was then La Verne College in California, it was 1959, and I had the choice of going into the military or becoming a conscientious objector and doing alternative service. I chose to do alternative service as a conscientious objector, and for me it wasn't hard. My father was a minister, and we were from a historic peace church. And after 2 months of training, I ended up in the Washington offices of a group known as International Voluntary Services.
Our desire to live in peace, our desire to be of help, they are serving this country well.
IVS was a small organization. It was founded in 1956 on the basis that Americans could help best with underdeveloped countries through sending small teams of young college graduates, agriculturalists, home economists, animal and poultry men, and others, to work in small countries such as Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Algeria, Liberia, and there were several teams working in the country of Laos. I can remember one recruit that we had for these teams was a man by the name of Edgar M. Buell from North Indiana. He was a farmer, and he was a bit older than the other recruits who were in their 20s. He was approximately 48 years old, and came to Washington, D.C. to talk with my boss, Dr. Knopfsinger, before he went to Laos. He talked with him an hour, we shook hands, he left for the airport, and my boss said, "What do you think about Mr. Buell?" I said, "Well, he seems a little bit older than the rest of our recruits." And my boss looked at me and said, "I think we're going to hear quite a lot about this man." A couple of years later, in 1962, I too found my way to Laos. After 5 years with IVS, mostly in Vientiane, I went down to Pak Se and worked with the Agency for International Development. I worked in Saravan, I worked in Kangkok, and then I returned to Vientiane and was there when Carol Mills decided to leave. Carol Mills was an old friend of mine, and she had been working with Pop Buell up on the Plain of Jars as a sort of a secretary, general administrative assistant. And it was time for her to leave, and besides, things were getting a little bit hot, and they did not want to have an American woman involved in case there was a military situation that had problems. I first met Pop in Laos when I drove a Jeep up to the entrance of the AID compound. This stands for USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development. So I talked to Pop, and he elected that I come and help him. I flew up with him to Sam Tong, which was a small outpost that was just south of the Plain of Jars. Sam Tong was just a short airstrip. It had a hospital at one end, and Pop was the AID coordinator for Xieng Quang province. His job, our job, was to find where the people were that needed rice, and they continued fight against what was known as the secret war in Laos. And by then, Pop Buell was famous. First, he was Pop Buell, so-called by the IVSers, with whom he worked on the Plain of Jars. And then he worked with Hmong, known then as the Male. The Hmong were not native to Laos. They came, as far as I know, from the reaches of Mongolia and the mountains of China. and had been chased southward for centuries. Now from the north, the Hmong and the Lao were being attacked by groups known as the Pathet Lao, who were Lao, that were against the royal government, and Vietnamese, who were helping them against all the laws that were laid down in the Geneva Accords in 1954. And the war had continued almost 12 years as the communist groups attempted to take over the country from the neutralist and the rightist groups, which were supported by the United States. The Hmong lived in very high places on very isolated hills. One of the problems is, while you can build a village by bringing bamboo and other things up, and putting a ring of trenches around to defend yourself from, the ground is not particularly good. You slash, burn the trees, you plant the rice, and burn the rubbish that is cut, and you can get 1, 2, maybe 3 harvests of the hill rice, but after that, you have to move on. The villages were quite isolated, but with the airline, basically, that we had flying back and forth, and 2 and 3 days marches, you would be able to begin connecting with other Hmong in this giant network of a Hmong nation. But you had to go to a village to find out what they were doing and what they needed. When someone was injured or wounded, they were flown to Sam Tong. When they arrived in Sam Tong for medical treatment and were ready to go, they would often just go to the airport. And the rationale made sense. Why should I walk 3 days back to my village when, if I wait here long enough, a plane will just pick us up and take us back to where we were? There was quite a lot of attrition among the Hmong soldiers. It got so bad that at one time, General Vang Pao had to send out the order that all students, male, up to the age of 11 were exempt from going in the Army, but if you were 11 years old, you were drafted and you ended up in the Hmong Army. I went out to the airstrip one day and saw a group of soldiers around a body. It was a very small body. Talked to a little boy next to it. He was 12 years old, and he was dressed in a uniform that was about 3 times too big. He was Hmong, but he knew Lao. And he said, "That is my friend, Li Gao. He and I both joined the Army a year ago when he was 10 and I was 11. And he was killed this week, and I am flying back with his body to the village that he came with." His rifle accompanied him, a small carbine suitable for that of a boy. The larger rifles went to taller, more grown-up men. But a helicopter or a plane picked up the body, and they picked up the gun, flew them back to the village. He was buried, and his carbine was then handed to the next boy that took his place in the Hmong army. They kept moving south. They kept moving downwards. And finally, it was decided that we had to evacuate the Plain of Jars. And the word went out. All the villagers agreed we will have to move elsewhere. They came down to the airstrips that were marked out on the dusty floor of the PDJ, and we would go up every day helping them with trucks and equipment and materials and so on to move to these pre-designated airstrips. The giant airplanes would come in. The C-123 would fly in a great deal of dust, and people divided up into villages, tasangs and muongs, would move in clamber aboard the airplanes through these giant tailgates, and then once the count was finished and the plane was full, these giant tailgates would fold up and they would fly down the airstrip to spots in Vientiane where they would be resettled. A number of months after the plane of jars was evacuated, one night went to a movie with the pilots who got kind of bored up in Samtong, and we brought up a movie camera and we showed movies in the evenings because there was not much else to do at an isolated base like this. And in the middle of the film, Pop walked in, the projector was turned off, and he said, "Everybody get some sleep. They're having a little bit problem to the south of us, and we may be evacuating tomorrow morning." The night before had been punctuated with the sound of noise south of us, where Longcheng was, and we could see flares being dropped out of the sky because the enemy had gotten into Longcheng and there was fighting going on. The next day, people started congregating at the airfield. We began to pack things. People were being put on aircraft and they were being flown down to this new site at Bam Son, Site 272, because we were going to evacuate Samtong. That evening, we stood around waiting, and finally, after hundreds and hundreds of people had left on aircraft being evacuated, finally they had one or two porters, an airplane, waiting, and Pop sauntered out from his house. We were all lined up next to the airstrip. He looked back. He said, "Oh heck, I never did like Samtong anyway." And he climbed onto the porter, and we all flew to Vientiane, and the next morning went up to this new place called Bam Son. At Bam Son, as in Samtong, we had a operations building which was near the runway, and the Nikongs and those of us who worked with Pop used the office. It had a window in the side and looked out on the runway, and we had our man with the microphone who would be giving instructions for the pilots. And the new hospital was built, only this time, instead of a good solid building, it was built more out of bamboo. It had 5 or 6 wards. It was above the ground. And I would take reporters in to see what there was at the hospital. One day, I had an assistant, Lee Sing, and I said, "Lee Sing, I have a camera here. Why don't you take some pictures?" And I showed him how to operate it. And several days later, came back, and Lee Sing had taken a roll of pictures, and I took them down and had them printed. One picture, I said, "What is this? This is quite unusual. Tell me." He told me that there had been an attack on the airfield the night before, and he'd heard people running. And the next morning, after everything was under control, he went out to the airfield, and just to the edge of the airfield found a woman who had been sick and come to Bam Son to have treatment. She and her husband and child had gone out to the airport, and when the shooting started, they picked up everything and ran, and her husband and her child had been hit and killed. The next morning, they were sitting at the airport. She had a blanket over the bodies, and she realized that she needed some money to buy something to eat for breakfast, and she reached down and she pulled the blanket from her husband and child, took some money out of his pocket, and then began to realize again that she had lost her husband and child in this long, seemingly never-ended war, and began to cry. And Lee Sing took this picture. I had a reporter once asked me to translate to one of the refugees. Ask him what he thinks of this war. And I said, I can't translate that. And he was on the defensive immediately, and he said, what do you mean you won't translate? And I said, well, I can't translate the question because it makes no sense the way you've told it. You can ask him if it's been a good war or a bad war, but he doesn't think of the war because he's in the middle of it. It's like asking a fish what he thinks of water. He's in the middle of the war, and the photographer immediately said, okay, has this been good or bad for his people? And the man replied, oh, the war has been very bad for my people. All we want to do is to farm on the hillsides and to plant our crops and to live in peace and be allowed to govern ourselves. I worked with the Hmong for probably about 2.5 years. And then one day I realized that I only had a few months left. And so I went to Pop and I said, Pop, I think it's time I go home. I feel at times as if we're on this giant rat race where a little squirrel will run and run and run and it gets nowhere. And it's difficult to believe, but I don't think the war is going to be won. I've been here too long, and I'm beginning to forget words in English. And Pop said, okay, no problem, you can go home. Another man came and he replaced me. I taught him everything that I knew, and he took over in my position. I came back to the United States, went back to school, and then several years later, they called me and they said, things have fallen apart in Laos and Vietnam, and they're coming, and we need you. I was painting a house, and I was looking through the window, and I could see people fleeing madly in Vietnam and helicopters being pushed off of ships. But the story I remember most intimately and says a lot for America was a young couple that came up. They spoke no English, they spoke Lao and Hmong. And it was a young boy and his wife. He was probably 20, she was probably about 19, and you looked at them and you knew from their clothes that they did not have very much. And the customs official says, what do you got in the bag? And they pulled open the bag. And in the bag was a little pot with a lid, 2 spoons, a few pieces of clothing, and a toothbrush. And the man said, whose toothbrush? And they both grabbed the toothbrush together, holding it between them and looking at us. And the man said, how much money do you have? And the husband looked in his pocket and he brought out the equivalent of about $3.81. Okay, said the customs official, you can go on. And they walked down through the door that led them to America. And he turned to me and he had tears in his eyes and he said, when I see people like that, I wonder how they can ever make it in the United States. They're poor, they don't have anything. And then I think my grandfather and grandmother, they came from the old country. And they didn't have anything either. And I know at that point that they can make it in the United States just like my grandparents did. It's a long and very uncomfortable history. The plight of the Hmong shows how much people will resist oppression and I can only rejoice in that so many of them were able to do so and come to the United States.